Hey guys, tonight we wander through a medieval village square, your sandals crunching on sun-baked dirt as the sky turns a rosy amber. Every inhaled puff carries the tang of smoke, livestock, and something vaguely sour that might be fermented cabbage, or worse, a leaking privy. You probably won't survive this unfiltered exposure to medieval hydration horrors, but hey, who said bedtime stories had to be safe? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead and post where you are right now and your local time in the chat. I swear I'm curious. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge toward the village well, throat as scratchy as an old wool blanket. The well's stone lip glistens with algae green sheen, and you can almost taste the slimy curl of bacteria dancing on the surface. In medieval Europe, people turned to wells and rivers as main water sources, even though waterborne diseases like dysentery claimed entire households in a summer sweep. Your heart flutters. This isn't exactly the spa day you imagined. A child laughs as he mutters about fresh frog water, a fringe trick supposedly blessed by a local wise woman. She swears frog saliva swaps toxins for sweetness. Historians still argue whether these slime-based treatments offered any real purification or just a sticky placebo. Dust motes swirl in the fading light while you brace yourself to lower the wooden bucket. Creak, creak, every groan of that pulley sounds like a warning. You wedge your fingers between splintered boards as you haul the bucket, remembering that this very well may host parasites you've never heard of and might never live through. It's sort of like medieval Gatorade, minus any guarantee you'll wake up refreshed tomorrow. You flex your grip, your knuckles whiten, and you wonder why everyone else seems so calm. It's because survival here hinges on knowing which sources to trust and which to avoid, if you can trust any of them at all. Crowds huddle, whispering of a recent bout of fever near the East Stream. They blame the blacksmith's smithy runoff, though no one's entirely sure. You sniff the air. There's a hint of burnt metal, a faint sheen of stench, and a suspicious swirl of greenish foam along the bank. Despite that, villagers still scoop handfuls into goatskin flasks and trudge back to their cottages. You suspect they're doing it more out of desperation than devotion. Historians still argue whether medieval stream water ever carried enough metals to contaminate bone long-term, or if that's just a modern worry projected backward. A grandmother nearby warns you to watch for cows crossing upstream because their dung can wash down the slope and turn your next gulp into a bacterial roulette. She gestures at your face. Drink too deep, and the next thing you know, you're guests of the fever ward. She's got a point. Open defecation and livestock sharing the same water source was a recipe for daily gamble. You chuckle dryly. Game night didn't prepare you for a role like that. But then again, maybe the lottery would be more comforting than whatever parasite is hitching a rye in your jug. You hoist the bucket and peer inside. Ripples shimmer, revealing a few curious tadpoles and a lone dragonfly nymph. They skitter away at your reflection, faster than you'd sprint from your responsibilities on a Monday morning. Those little critters don't care that you're wondering if they're friendly or just munching on protozoa. You tell yourself that if the water teems with life, maybe it's at least halfway safe, a common medieval logic trick that might have saved a few throats from the worst nasties. Historians still argue whether that see no evil heuristic held any real microbiological merit or just simple wishful thinking. Securing the bucket, you pivot toward a barrel of rainwater sitting under a tiled overhang. It glints with anticipation, a forgotten chlorine factory of the Middle Ages. But as you edge closer, you spot leaves and bits of moss bobbing on the surface, organic sediment that could ferment into unplanned kombucha. You resist the gag reflex. Clever villagers sometimes scraped the top layer off, believing the murky debris carried away impurities. You've heard that's about as effective as shrugging off Monday blues with a motivational quote. A yelp splits the air. Someone has plunged face first into a muddy gutter trying to snatch a leaky jug. You stifle a laugh. It's slapstick relief amid genuine peril. You shake your head, rapping your knuckles on empty air. This is day-to-day life when clean water can kill you just as easily as save you. You take a deep breath and think, my voice might be soft and whispery, but medieval water was anything but gentle. You slip away from the well's algae sheen, dusting damp palms on your tunic as the village fades behind you. Ahead, the river's gentle gurgle beckons like a lullaby, yet you know its melody hides dangers. You step onto smooth stones at the bank, feeling cool mist kiss your ankles. Medieval settlements clustered around rivers for transport, irrigation, and drinking water. Some towns even paid tolls for the privilege of tapping that flowing artery. You lean over, toes skimming the current, and wonder if that ancient fee was more a communal blessing or just the local lord's sneaky way of funding a new jousting tournament. Beneath your fingers, the river water glides slippery as olive oil. You scoop a tentative handful, wavering between thirst and dread. Upstream, laundry pursuits turn sword-ringing into a makeshift spa day, soap scum dotting the surface like polka dots on a royal gown. You might expect that wearing all that linen and hauling crusty rags would feel anti-ASMR, but laundry day also meant fresh linens at home, worth the occasional side of skin itch. You blink at the suds drifting past, convinced you're not certain which offends your nostrils more, soap or whatever those rags once absorbed. A bird shrieks overhead. You squat low and peer into the swirling depths. Tufts of waterweed drift by, along with a chubby tadpole nodding at you in hollow agreement. Remember that dragonfly nymph from the well? Here, it's joined by aquatic pals you never signed up to host. River water could carry giardia or whipworm eggs, turning a simple gulp into a week-long bed-bound pity party. You grimace, aware that medieval sufferers might have chalked it up to wind in the bowels. Historians still argue whether people back then recognized these symptoms as disease or simply cursed bad weather for rearranging their organs. You rise, the smooth stones threatening an impromptu dip if you catch your heel wrong. Bandits, you've heard, lurked along these banks, targeting water patrons whose arms bulged with full flasks. Imagine getting mugged not for coins or livestock, but for your precious water supply, and then having to explain to the village priest why you're parched again. You laugh softly at the absurdity of medieval mugging etiquette. Hand over your water skins and no one gets dehydrated. Jokes aside, river robbers weren't a myth. They capitalized on the desperation of travelers crossing arid plains. You explore a bend sheltered by willow boughs. The shade invites peace, but it also harbors hidden hazards. Livestock crossings upstream could turn your water into a bacterial stew. You notice hoofprints set in muddy banks. Cow, goat, maybe a sheep debating its next drink. That same grandmother from the well warned of dung-borne disease. Here you see her point. Livestock and humans alike shared the currents, a practice that made every sip a shot in the microbial dark. A peasant woman appears, balancing two clay jugs atop her head, a precarious architecture challenge you'd fail miserably. She greets you with nods and dips one jug to fill it. Better than well water, she boasts, but not by much. You quirk an eyebrow. She swears that rivers flowing through certain hills taste sweeter, thanks to natural chalk filters along the bedrock. The chalk supposedly neutralizes pathogens, though whether it did more than polish water hardness is uncertain. You imagine medieval water tasters as proto-sommeliers, swishing their samples and proclaiming notes of chalky limestone or light goat detritus. You crouch beside a sun-bleached log, resting your jugs. A sweltering midday sun turns the riverbank into a sauna chamber, punctuated by occasional gusts rustling reeds. The breeze carries a whiff of fish oil and hidden rot, and reminds you that this serene spot witnessed more than just water collection. In times of siege or flood, that same river swelled into a roaring beast, sweeping away palisades and reshaping the land. Medieval chronicle keepers wrote poetic laments about rivers that tore through fields, then returned to calm whispers in a single night. You shiver, mindful that water can heal and hurt in equal measure. Glancing downstream, you spot a primitive watermill's overshot wheel creaking as it turns grain into flour. The miller's family has relied on that wheel for generations, their livelihoods turning on every rotation. Everyone in town pays a mill fee, flour in exchange for grinding power. You realize that water wasn't just hydration, it powered economies, ground grains, and even inspired early tax systems. Without rivers, the medieval world's trade arteries would have been as lifeless as a drained moat. You lift a jug and tip it toward your lips. The liquid slides down your throat, cold relief chasing away your racing heartbeat. You savor the moment, but your brain reminds you to stay vigilant. A sudden cloud of black flies signals upstream carrion, maybe a deer that didn't make it. Foul-smelling swarms drift over you, producing a buzzing track that's medieval TikTok's version of a "you've been served." You gulp faster, determined to outrun their interest. A local boy appears, dipping a reed pipe into the shallows. He sucks through it, claiming it filters out grit. You watch as he giggles, convinced he's mastered water purification technology centuries early. Spoiler, that pipe probably did as much as whistling into a sausage link. Historians still argue whether such homemade gadgets ever offered true protection or simply boosted confidence and maybe entertained kids for an afternoon. As you refill your final flask, you notice the weaving network of tributaries fanning out like veins. Those smaller streams fed distant hamlets, becoming lifelines in their own right. And while one village's riverbank might look pristine, another's could pass through tanneries, blacksmith shops, and open latrines before reaching any faucet, if faucets ever existed. You realize you've been lucky with today's bend. No dead livestock floats by, no stench like last week's broken sewer pipe near town. Yet you know tomorrow holds no guarantees. Hoisting both jugs, you trace your path back toward the village, envisioning every footstep registering a diplomatic treaty with gravity. Bandits might lurk, but your larger rival is exhaustion. Water halls demand more muscle than brawniest knight. Still, you relish that cool swirl in your belly, the sweet hint of survival. You pat the nearest clay jug, as if offering thanks to an inanimate friend that won't judge your drinking habits. The river hum fades behind you, replaced by distant church bells announcing vespers. You take one last look at the river of water, thinking about how medieval folks balanced risk and reward every day. Rivers carried life, commerce, and, occasionally, death. And here you stand, jugs in hand, breathing that paradox. You step into the morning hush of the village square, where the communal well stands like a granite sentinel. Cool dawn light catches the iron ring bolted into its mossy stone curb, and you inhale that damp earth aroma that clings to centuries of splashed water. A pair of laborers grunt as they crank the wooden windlass, lowering a rope and bucket rig that rattles through the well shaft. Wells in medieval Europe often reached depths of 30 to 50 meters to reach uncontaminated groundwater, a laborious feat that defined countless village calendars and power dynamic. You rub your forearm where the bucket's rope chafes, tasting metal tang on your tongue even before you draw the water. Villagers gather around in loose clusters, socializing like it's the weekly tavern meet, except this bar serves liquids straight from the earth. You overhear whispers about who holds the key to the well cover. The local miller claims the Lord granted him token control, though you suspect it's more a modern rumor dressed in feudal regalia. The oldest matriarch in the crowd cackles, saying witches once danced on the well's edge to bless the water's flow. You smile, remembering that fringe tidbit about dropping a dried newt into the well for luck. Apparently, the amphibian spirit would ward off misfortune and keep ills at bay. Historians still argue whether these ritualistic practices actually improved water quality or simply offered psychological comfort for villagers who feared unseen threats. You lean in, mindful of that debate, as the windlass creaks and a wooden bucket emerges, dripping ancient liquid back onto the stone. You extend your hands, palms up, to catch the first few drops, like medieval acupuncture for your parched skin. The water smells faintly of minerals and something you can't quite place, a hint of sulfur mixed with toasted grains. Nearby, a burly man heaves the bucket free and pours the water into clay jugs and goatskin bladders. The jugs' rims are nicked and stained from years of use. Each scar tells a saga of dents and cracks patched with beeswax. You notice one jug has been sealed with a copper patch, a rare metal in rural hamlets, traded in secret by tinkerfolk who claimed copper's antimicrobial properties could ward off dysentery. Whether that worked or whether the wax itself was just tasty, no one seems certain. Historians still argue whether such DIY patches conferred genuine protection or were merely decorative. With your jug in hand, you step aside to let a mother and her toddler approach. The child giggles as the rope swings past her chubby fingers, nearly taking her off balance. She squeals, making the well area look oddly like a medieval playground, if playgrounds involved precarious pulleys instead of rubber slides. You wonder if the villagers' collective trust in the structure ever waned, forgetting that a single snapped rope could turn community service into a tragedy. The well's overseer taps the rope with a carved wooden staff, a symbol of his appointment by the village council. He keeps order, ensuring a fair turn for everyone, though rumors persist that some pay bribes of eggs or butter to skip ahead, because even water queues had their own VIP lanes. The square hums with murmurs. A traveling clerk, ink-stained and wide-eyed, records water usage fees in his leather ledger. Tolls for well water were common in larger towns. Some chronicles mention fees equivalent to a loaf of bread per bucket. You consider that farmers who couldn't pay might resort to secret nighttime draws, risking both punishment and potential collapse of the well's pulley mechanism. The clerk's ledger smells of ink and vellum. You imagine the toll entries look like medieval before and after shots of economic strain. As you stand there, sunlight grows stronger, turning morning mist into glimmering specks that dance across the stone. You angle your jug to fill it, noting how the clear water glitters with suspended microparticles, sediment so fine you couldn't see it until it caught the light just right. A nearby apothecary vendor, setting up shop, warns that sediment can harbor giardia cysts and recommends you let the water stand for an hour before drinking. Ancient filtration advice. Some say it works, others call it superstition. Historians still argue whether simple sedimentation truly reduced disease risk in pre-modern communities. You crouch on the curb's edge, placing your jug down for a moment. The stone is slick with moss, and you slide your hand across grooves worn deep by centuries of buckets. Every indent feels like a fingerprint left by unknown hands, each one connecting you to toil and hope of villagers long gone. You dab at your brow, sticky with sweat and anticipation, sensing that this well is more than an H2O source. It's the village's pulse, where gossip, politics, and daily survival converge like stones in the well shaft. Above you, a hawk circles, its screech echoing off nearby timber-framed houses. You yank your focus back to the jugs, now half full, and hear a low rumble as the windlass taches on a misshapen tooth in its gear. The pulley jams, and buckets sway like pendulums ready to swing someone into the well shaft if the overseer isn't quick. He mutters a few syllables that could be curses, could be prayers, you can't tell. His brow creases like parchment under quill tip. Within seconds, he dislodges the stuck gear, and the windlass resumes its steady orbit, dumping another bucket of water onto the curb. Your jug is nearly full. You brace the handle with one hand, shifting it to snug under your elbow as if it might slip at any moment. Villagers behind you sigh in relief as their turn draws near. Everyone shares that ritual sigh when water becomes a rationed indulgence instead of a free-flowing right. You smile at your reflection in the jug's surface, a war-weary traveler wearing linen robes, boots caked in mud. You lean in for a sip and taste dusty chalk notes, the kind you licked on classroom slates as a child, combined with the faintest hint of brine. You consider the well's construction. Lined with dressed stone rings and sealed with clay mortar, it rises like a testament to communal engineering. Some ambitious lords funded rope-driven treadmills in larger cities, enabling women to operate wells without burning calves or ankles. You recall reading about Roman-style bucket elevators making a late comeback in certain castle fortresses, though whether they spread to humble villages is debated. Historians still argue whether advanced pulleys filtered down to rural communities or stayed locked behind castle doors. Shouldering your water, you pivot to depart, but not before noticing faint carvings on the well side, initials and hearts scratched by starry-eyed couples centuries ago. You trace one heart, imagining that young lovers kissed here, letting their breath fog the stone before slipping away. It strikes you that even in survival mode, people still wanted to carve romance into their water supply. Maybe love mixes well with H2O, you muse, or maybe it just clings to communal chaos. As you turn, the matriarch who dropped the frog joker earlier approaches, handing you an egg sealed in wax. For luck, she says, well egg will protect the jug's spirit. You bow your head, then tuck the egg into your satchel, certain it won't crack. Eggshell was supposed to absorb toxins, some believed, though you file that under medieval Instagram hacks that might have gone viral. Assuming medieval folk had hashtags. Jug strapped to your belt, you step onto the sun-warmed cobbles, water sloshing gently inside. The square stirs to midday buzz, a mix of chatter, horsebeats, and the occasional clang from the blacksmith's forge. You exhale, marveling at how one well can mirror an entire society's fears and ingenuity. You feel heavier, not just from liquid, but from witnessing that communal heartbeat, an everyday crossroads where survival, superstition, and social order interlock like stones in the well shaft. You step into the courtyard of a timber-framed manor, your boots tapping against flagstones slick with morning dew. Above you, gutter spouts curve gracefully from steeply pitched roofs, directing precious rainwater into hidden stone cisterns below. In medieval Europe, cisterns were a common solution for water scarcity. Villages and castles alike dug subterranean chambers lined with plaster or lead to store runoff from roofs, sometimes holding several thousand liters of water from months of drought. Mainstream fact. You run your hand along a mossy downspout, imagining the first drop of rain trickling through oak shingles, carrying whispers of sky and storm into earthbound reservoirs. A thin trickle of water drips from a copper gutter, each drop landing with a soft plop into a carved stone hopper. The sound lulls you like distant raindrops on a tent, an ASMR memory of rainy afternoons. You lift your face and close your eyes, catching the faint scent of wet wood and distant lavender from a nearby herb garden. It feels almost spa-like, until you recall the murky swirl of tadpoles and nymphs in the village well. Rainwater might seem pristine, but roofs collected more than H2O. Bark fragments, bird droppings, and decaying leaves all found their way onto tiles, turning cisterns into aquatic terrariums teeming with algae blooms and mosquito larvae. Historians still argue whether medieval cistern maintenance routines were rigorous enough to prevent rampant contamination. You pad toward a low stone cover topped by a decorative iron wheel, a lid that once kept out curious animals and unwanted debris. You glance at the carved cherub relief, wondering if the workshop artisan was paid more for cute-a-bit cuteness or for hiding tiny fissures in the lid that let in extra dampness. With a gentle twist of the wheel, the cover grinds open, revealing a dark gullet lined with streaks of green and black. You shine a small lantern inside, watching motes swirl like suspended confetti. One glows unnervingly. Was that a piece of roofing clay sheared off by a hailstorm? Or something more sinister, like frog spawn drifting free? A slimy strand cues your memory. Remember those dragonfly nymphs from the well? Here, rainwater cisterns boasted their own menagerie. Leaning over, you drop a length of rope into the chamber, feeling the resistance of thick, oily water. When you haul up the bucket, it smells faintly sweet, nectar-like, almost hopeful, but with an undercurrent of wet stone. You dip a finger, then your entire palm, and taste a faint planktonic hint before swallowing a cautious sip. It slides down your throat like filtered clouds, cold and oddly refreshing. Yet you suppress a wince as you imagine medieval cistern cleaners descending by ladder to scoop out silt with wooden paddles, risking tunnel collapses and inhaling spores that could give them coughs lasting into old age. You circle the cistern, brushing away ivy tendrils that threaten to trap moisture against the stone. Nearby, a mason's coin lies stacked neatly, awaiting repair. You recall a quirky tip passed down from monastic texts. Sealing cistern walls with crushed snail shells purportedly added a faint alkaline scrub, keeping slimy films at bay. Quirky tidbit. You wonder if those monks tasted victory, or just tasted their own snail mix. Historians still argue whether biological sealants like crushed shells or animal fats ever made a noticeable difference, or if they simply offered anxious caretakers something to scrape at while waiting for the next rain. The courtyard hush is broken by rhythmic clangs as roofers replace broken shingles. You watch a young apprentice toss a slate tile over his shoulder, nearly striking the manor cat. He grins sheepishly, shrugs, and mutters, "Practice makes perfect." You can't help imagining medieval YouTube fails featuring epic tile flinging, #roofrage style. But slates mattered. Smaller gaps let more debris in. Bigger gaps made water flow too freely, risking overflow when torrential rains came. Overflow drains, you learn, channeled excess water into drainage ditches, minimizing erosion around foundations, a delicate dance between too little and too much. Shadow creeps into the cistern opening as a storm cloud rolls overhead. You tilt your head, eyes tracking dark shapes on the horizon. Soon, raindrops will patter on the roof, a welcome symphony if you're lucky, an inhalation hazard if you're not. Some medieval chroniclers described rainwater as sweeter than any spring, attributing purity to its celestial origin. Others noted sudden taste changes after metal roofs corroded, imparting a tang of copper or lead. You shift your weight, recalling that lead was used in larger cisterns, despite its toxicity, simply because it resisted water pressure and molded well into curved vaults. Historians still argue whether lead poisoning from cisterns contributed to mental health declines among medieval elites, or if those tales are just Tudor gossip. Raindrops begin to drum on wooden shingles, quickening from sporadic taps to steady percussion. You lean over the hopper, licking your lips in anticipation. A leaf spirals down the gutter, hitchhiking on incoming water before snagging on the hopper's corner. You pluck it away with a stick, tossing it onto the courtyard floor. You wonder if medieval caretakers had dedicated cistern leafers whose sole job was flicking organic imposters into compost piles. Soon, the steady sheet of rain fills the hopper, gurgling into the cistern. You listen to the increasing roar, feeling a thrill at nature's cooperation with human engineering. You step back to avoid muddy splashes. No one loves a damp hem at a manor dinner. The first swell of water sends hairsprays of droplets skyward, dusting you with ground-in grime from months of dry spells. You pat your shoulder, half laughing at the medieval exfoliation treatment you didn't ask for. As the cistern swells, you pace the rim as if diffusing a ticking bomb. Too much water and the overflow spouts could wash away prized herb beds and topple decorative urns. Too little, and your household risks cooking porridge with tepid well water again. You glance at the manor's herb garden, a careful arrangement of lavender, rosemary, and mugwort. Collecting rainwater meant easier irrigation for sensitives like lavender, which flopped under hard water's harsh mineral load. You imagine medieval gardeners toasting the rain,
glass tankards raised high in aromatic salute. You lean on a barrel brimming with last season's reserves, tipping it slightly to inspect clarity. Bits of green algae cling to the inside, creating a fuzzy tapestry at the waterline. You dip a twig to stir the surface and watch the algae swirl into tiny eddies, mocking your quest for purity. This battle against green fuzz preoccupied many an estate manager, who sometimes resorted to adding vinegar or goat's milk to slightly acidify the water and inhibit growth. Whether that worked beyond a placebo remains a point of contention. Historians still argue whether organic additives ever suppressed algae more effectively than sheer manual scooping. A distant peal of thunder rumbles through the rafters. You smile, raising your voice in a gentle ASMR whisper. Just you, me, the storm, and gallons of medieval rainwater ready for anything life throws at us, except maybe a rogue lightning bolt. You pause, savoring the electric charge dancing in the cold courtyard air. Then you step toward the hopper to secure its ornate lid before the storm intensifies. You twist the iron wheel, and the cover thunks into place, silencing the cistern's roar into a low growl. Satisfied, you step back into the courtyard's wooden archway, shrugging off a few stray droplets. You pat your cloak, grateful that rainwater harvesting offered medieval folk a thrilling mix of reward and risk. Then you look skyward, the storm dark but drenching, and think, if they could master these cisterns without modern tech, maybe I can handle my leaky apartment roof next time it rains.
You leave the echoing drip of cisterns behind and wander toward the tavern's wooden sign swinging in the drizzle. Its painted mug of frothy ale feels like a beacon, promising sticky mugs, hearty laughs, and water purification by fermentation. Inside, the hearth radiates warmth and a heady plume of sweet malt and roasted barley. Medieval folk brewed small ale daily, literally every household downed a few pints before breakfast to avoid deadly pathogens lurking in unboiled water, mainstream fact. You settle onto a creaking bench, your sodden cloak shedding motes of mud as you clutch a squat tankard, eager for your first sip. The barkeep slides over a foaming mug and whispers, "Second one's on the house if you can out-gargle old Margaret here." You eye the old woman across the bar, her gnarled fingers measuring ale bubbles with solemn intensity. Gargling with ale was a fringe ritual. Some scholars say improved one's singing voice, or at least guaranteed a slurred one worth a chorus of laughs. Quirky tidbit. Historians still argue whether small ale's alcohol content, often below 3%, actually killed all the nasties or merely offered a comforting placebo. You lift the tankard, and the foam lingers around your lips like a sugar mustache for livestock. The liquid tastes of toasted bread crusts, honeyed malt, and a faint tang that reminds you of the copper patches on well jugs. You swallow and feel immediate relief, like someone rebooted your internal antiquated plumbing. A stray drop trickles down your chin, you wipe it with your sleeve and leave a dark smudge, fashionable in some circles, frowned upon at royal courts. Behind you, a group of peasants debates whether boiled meat broth qualifies as real food or just flavored water with attitude. You lean forward and nod sagely. If broth can save my life, I'll let it have all the attitude it wants. Boiling water with animal scraps formed the backbone of medieval soups and broths. Heat killed bacteria and turned otherwise tough scraps into edible nectar. Even nuns in convents relied on bone broth as both nourishment and crude medicine, prescribing a spoonful for fever and fatigue, mainstream fact. You inhale the faint aroma of lamb shanks twirling above coals in the kitchen, imagining the broth's depth of flavor could rival modern pho, just with fewer trendy garnishes. As you sip, your brain playfully calculates modern brew ratios. Hop, malt, barley. Monks might have been the first microbrewers before that was a hipster badge. You pat the tankard, thinking monks of certain abbeys crafted ales so potent they dubbed them liquid bread. Yet some blamed these abbey ales for drunken rowdiness in town square, as if medieval morals sagged more from pints than from puberty. You crack a grin, joking to yourself that, truthfully, medieval farmers probably had more water in their wine than in their water. A blacksmith swaggering in reminds you of last week's riverbank expedition. He plunks down and orders a double pint. "River water's fine," he boasts, "but these days I trust foam more than fish oil." You laugh, remembering the chubby tadpole nodding at you like a tiny lifeguard. He sighs and admits he once contracted dysentery after a river binge. Studying medieval TikTok for home remedies included soaking barley husks in tub water overnight. You wince. That barley scrub tactic probably did more sanding than sanitizing. The barkeep returns with a steaming bowl of vegetable broth seasoned with wild herbs, parsley, thyme, and a questionable sprig of wormwood. Wormwood once adorned ale vats to repel insects. Fringe healers claimed it also offered protection against evil spirits, though critics sniffed at the idea that bitterness kept demons at bay rather than gut microbes. Quirky tidbit. You stir the broth, watching tiny flecks swirl like galaxies in a wooden bowl. It smells faintly of forest floor and promises to settle your rattled stomach after the cistern escapade. You balance the broth bowl on the table's edge and lift one foot, dodging a scuttling cockroach that fancies itself a dinner guest. It skitters under a stool just as your elbow teeters, sending a droplet of broth across the table. Medieval slip and slide hazard avoided. You catch your reflection in the mug's polished interior, exhaustion mixed with curiosity, goggles-level interest in sanitation hacks old enough to predate castles. Between sips, you overhear a scholar in scholar blue robes debating broth versus ale as superior disinfectants. He argues that boiling water removed solids but retained flavorless bacteria spores, and only alcohol dealt a death blow. His colleague retorts that alcohol extract might dehydrate cells, making reproduction unlikely rather than outright killing them. The conversation circles like a water wheel on repeat. Historians still argue whether medieval boiling techniques truly eliminated all pathogens or simply reduced them to manageable levels. A child darts past, clutching a tiny wooden cup. She peers at your bowl and blurts, "Is that soup or potion?" The barkeep winks at you. Why not both? In medieval times, soup doubled as medicine. The child slurps from her cup, wiggles her nose, and pronounces it dragon stew, reminding you of that dragonfly nymph earlier, minus the exoskeleton crunch. You chuckle, picturing a toddler in a white coat prescribing broth for winged encounters. Your tankard is empty now, but you resist refilling until you finish the broth, courtesy of a barkeep determined to maintain pub etiquette. You let out a contented breath as the warm liquid coats your throat. Boiled water from hard-to-reach springs never tasted so nurturing. You note the broth's oil sheen on top, a shimmering promise of hydration and nutrition in one slurp. Settling back, you notice fresh bales of straw on the tavern floor, designed to absorb spills and replace your modern coaster. You lift an eyebrow, teasing yourself that even then they worried about tabletop etiquette and sticky spots. If only they'd invented dishwasher racks, you muse, maybe the blacksmith wouldn't haggle so much over ale fees. You finish your bowl and nap the rim with a ragged piece of lemon. The barkeep nods at your empty vessel and winks. Your jug of broth to go? You laugh, declining because hauling a bowl around might raise eyebrows. Imagine the look when you juggle tankard in one hand, broth bowl in the other, and a bag of eggs in your satchel. Instead, you refill your tankard with the house small ale, celebrating bromance between alcohol and broth as medieval cross-training in sanitation. As you swing your mug, you reflect on the interplay of heat and fermentation, two methods that inadvertently purified medieval hydration. Boiling turned raw water into savory life source, while fermentation turned potable gruel into fortified elixir. You consider modern water filters, carbon, reverse osmosis, and think medieval folks would label them dark wizardry.
You smile, knowing that sometimes a simple flame and a handful of grain were enough to keep communities buzzing and safe. Last drops of ale slide down your throat. The tavern's hearth crackles, embers dancing like fireflies, wrapping the room in amber light. You sip slowly, savoring the nuance of malt. You tap the table legs in gentle ASMR cadence, lulling any lingering doubts that this humble brew could indeed stand guard between you and unseen microbes. In a drink where bubbles are shields and barley is armor, you acknowledge the simple genius of medieval innovation. With a final, satisfying slurp, you set down the tankard. You pat your belly, tracing imaginary constellations across its surface, marking triumphs over unsanitary water. You whisper to yourself, no snake oil filter could match this meal, and the tavern's soft groans of chairs and murmur of voices feel like a lullaby. You stand, collecting your jugs and bowl, preparing to tread back out into the world, where every step and sip carries its own gamble.
You step into the cool dusk air, jugs swinging gently at your sides as you follow a narrow lane lit by sputtering oil lanterns. Ahead, the silhouette of a humble cottage reveals wisps of smoke curling from a low chimney. A faint clinking draws your attention. Someone's tinkering with a makeshift filter rig on the doorstep. You approach, curious to see folk technology in action. Because while castles boasted cisterns and lords enjoyed lead pipes, most medieval folks couldn't swish quills in royal budgets. Instead, they relied on sand, gravel, and charcoal packed into earthenware vessels to filter their daily sips. Early sand filtration systems emerged by the 11th century in parts of Europe and the Middle East, a grassroots leap toward cleaner water long before municipal plumbing mainstream fact. The cottage occupant, a wiry man in soot-stained leather breeches, beckons you closer. He's assembled layers of rough-hewn cloth, coarse sand, and charcoal fragments inside a hollowed clay pot. Each layer serves its own purpose. Cloth catches twigs and insects, sand traps pebbly grit, and charcoal promises to absorb foul tastes and colors. He holds a cracked goat's milk bowl beneath the spout, waiting for the first filtered drips. You lean in, watching amber-tinged water ooze through the strata, its flow as languid as molasses. The scent is faintly smoky, like a campfire retreat or the soft aftertaste when you toast marshmallows too close to coals. You dip one finger into the stream, lift it to your lips, and taste a surprising clarity. Gone is the chalky grit of the well and the fish oil tang of the river. This water feels like someone distilled evening breezes and dropped them into a cup. Pleasure flares in your chest, but you can't shake a cautious skepticism. Medieval filters were often slow and clogged, requiring daily cleaning if they were to perform at all. Historians still argue whether these simple filters truly removed pathogens or merely tricked users into thinking they'd overcome microscopic villains. The man smiles and rattles the charcoal in his hand. "It bites its stink," he says, tapping the porous pieces with a wooden mallet. Carved from burnt oak by traveling charcoal burners, bless their blisters. He explains that some filter makers believed burning off the lighter bits of wood left behind activated carbon, that mystical coating which could trap impurities. Fringe healers even claimed that adding crushed mint leaves to the charcoal layer added antiseptic power and a minty finish, ancient gum flavor, if you will. Quirky tidbit. He dips a rope brush into the filter's mouth, drawing out black slivers that cling like stray eyelashes. You quip, "So this is basically medieval Brita?" He chuckles, slapping his knee. "Aye, but without the plastic or the Netflix account." His humor sinks in as you realize that this cottage filter feels more like a sacred relic than a parlor novelty. It carries on the age-old dream of purifying every drop, a dream as persistent as roadside taverns promising ale stronger than a knight's grip. A sudden squawk breaks the calm. A hawk swoops overhead, casting a lengthening shadow over the yard. You remember the river's dragonfly nymph and the well's tadpoles. Here, charcoal and sand vie for supremacy in a microscopic battlefield. The cottage filter's water might look pristine, but tiny cysts could slip through the gaps between sand grains. You've heard that some medieval filter makers layered horsehair for extra fineness, a fringe recipe that might have stopped larger critters, but certainly not all pathogens. Historians still argue whether these hair sieves ever offered meaningful protection or just boosted morale. The man pours another bowlful and slides it toward you on a roughly hewn plank. You cradle the bowl as if it's hot ceramic bread, feeling warmth seeping through your fingers. Steam rises in ghostly threads, carrying aromas of ember smoke and wet earth. When you lift the bowl to sip, the filtered water feels almost luminous, as if made of captured moonlight. But you pause mid-sip, studying the sediment at the bottom of the bowl, a faint swirl of ochre that escaped the charcoal's lure. You recall the apothecary's advice to let filtered water rest before drinking, allowing residual particles to settle. Some medieval guides insisted on leaving water undisturbed for hours, though practicality often shortened the wait to as long as dinner preparations took. You down the rest anyway because dinner prep has no mercy on thirst. He extols the filter's virtues: fewer stomach aches, less frequent pit stops in the chamber pot, and improved bread quality when bakers switched from well water to filtered water for their dough. Bakers prized consistent hydration, claiming that loaves rose higher, crusts crisper, and crumbs softer, attributes that turned bread into legend at regional markets. You nod, imagining how a crisp crust loaf paired with fine cheese might spark more pilgrim envy than a tapestry. A sudden squawk breaks the calm. A hawk swoops overhead, casting a lengthening shadow over the yard. You remember the river's dragonfly nymph and the well's tadpoles. Here, charcoal and sand vie for supremacy in a microscopic battlefield. The cottage filter's water might look pristine, but tiny cysts could slip through the gaps between sand grains. You've heard that some medieval filter makers layered horsehair for extra fineness, a fringe recipe that might have stopped larger critters, but certainly not all pathogens. Historians still argue whether these hair sieves ever offered meaningful protection or just boosted morale. The man pours another bowlful and slides it toward you on a roughly hewn plank. You cradle the bowl as if it's hot ceramic bread, feeling warmth seeping through your fingers. Steam rises in ghostly threads, carrying aromas of ember smoke and wet earth. When you lift the bowl to sip, the filtered water feels almost luminous, as if made of captured moonlight. But you pause mid-sip, studying the sediment at the bottom of the bowl, a faint swirl of ochre that escaped the charcoal's lure. You recall the apothecary's advice to let filtered water rest before drinking, allowing residual particles to settle. Some medieval guides insisted on leaving water undisturbed for hours, though practicality often shortened the wait to as long as dinner preparations took. You down the rest anyway because dinner prep has no mercy on thirst. He extols the filter's virtues: fewer stomach aches, less frequent pit stops in the chamber pot, and improved bread quality when bakers switched from well water to filtered water for their dough. Bakers prized consistent hydration, claiming that loaves rose higher, crusts crisper, and crumbs softer, attributes that turned bread into legend at regional markets. You nod, imagining how a crisp crust loaf paired with fine cheese might spark more pilgrim envy than a tapestry. A feminine voice drifts from inside the cottage. Is the filter working? You hear a clatter of pots and a low hum of singing, likely a blessing song meant to appease water sprites. The odd blend of ceremony and craftsmanship never fails to amuse you. You remember the pagan practice of offering honey cakes to mermaids, in the belief those spirits would keep household water pure. Such rituals blurred the line between superstition and sanitation, a hallmark of medieval ingenuity and anxiety both. As the sun dips behind thatched rooftops, the yard's shadows deepen. The man demonstrates cleaning. He overturns the pot, lets the cloth sack drop out, scrapes sand and charcoal into a woven basket, and rinses the cloth in the latrine stream. Rather ironic, considering that very stream once jabbed at your water jugs. He cautions that maintenance is a chore nobody relishes, which is why many villages abandon filters in favor of boiled ale or pure luck.
You crack a grin at the image of townsfolk dragging a filter setup to the Lord's manor, begging for someone else to maintain it. You lean on the plank, resting the empty bowl against your chest. The wooden plank's rough texture reminds you of the well's stone curb and the cistern's iron wheel. It all feels like parts of a mechanical symphony that kept medieval life humming. You feel a tingle at the back of your neck, like flickers of curiosity and exhaustion tangled together. You whisper, "Next time someone brags about their home filter, I'll know the hustle behind every grain of sand." You ask about the cost. "A handful of silver pennies," he says, "for a basic filter that lasts a year if you don't mind wrestling with grit." Better models used glazed vessels, more expensive clay that touted tighter pores. Lead-glazed pottery was popular among higher classes despite its toxicity, an ironic leap when comparing to castle cisterns. Historians still argue whether lead-lined filters did more harm than the pathogens they aimed to block. The cottage grounds grow dim. Lanterns flicker as the man packs away the filter's parts. A cloth bag, a small wooden tamper, and bits of leftover charcoal. Some chunks black, some dust red. He presses the charcoal into a leather pouch, slapdash fertilizer for his garden. "Charcoal's good for soil too," he says. "Keeps roots cozy and bugs angry." You quirk an eyebrow. This multitasking charcoal hack feels like medieval Swiss Army trickery. You shoulder your jugs, water sloshing in measured sloshes. The filtered water tastes sweeter against your lips, leaving a subtle aftertaste of smoke and earth. You tuck the bowl under your arm, grateful for the cottage's gift of practical magic. As you step onto the lane, the scent of damp straw and moss rises from the cobblestones, mingling with the filter's smoky memory. You walk with the sure knowledge that medieval filtration folklore blended real science, superstition, and stubborn trial and error. An alchemy.
You wander past the cottage lantern glow and follow the village path until the air thickens with steam, scenting of rosemary, thyme, and something cinnamon-spiced. Ahead, under a linen canopy, a trio of women stirs bubbling cauldrons of murky water over low fires. Their aprons are streaked with green tea leaves and flecks of saffron, and you can almost hear the herbs whispering to the liquid. Medieval herbalists believed that certain plants could counteract waterborne miasmas, prescribing infusions of mint and wormwood to ward off stomach maladies as early as the 12th century, mainstream fact. You lean in, inhaling aromas that mingle like a medieval high-end spa menu, except this spa doubles as public health. One woman ladles water into a wooden bowl and drops in crushed rosemary sprigs, stirring until the leaves swirl like emerald confetti. She nods at you, her lined face brightening under the orange firelight. "Rosemary's for remembrance," she says, dipping a sprig to infuse clarity into both mind and belly. You quirk an eyebrow. Your memory could definitely use the help after that well descent where you almost forgot which end was up. She sprinkles in sticks of cinnamon bark next, claiming its oils broke down murky particles and made the water taste less like pond residuum and more like festive mulled cider. As you watch, a second woman produces a handful of juniper berries, rolling them between her palms as if they were smooth pebbles. She drops them in with a flourish and taps the bowl's rim, to chase away anything that crawled in upstream. You swallow a chuckle. So far you've seen dragonfly nymphs, tadpoles, and cow hoof prints, but now the berries join the guest list. Fringe healers once recommended dropping donkey urine into water vessels to wash toxins from herbal concoctions, though most families stuck to spices instead of excrement-based filters. Quirky tidbit. You cover your nose at the memory of that grandmother warning about dung-laden rivers. The cauldron's surface ripples as the last pot of water sloshes in. You hear an intermittent hiss from the fire, punctuating the lady's low hum, a melody of domestic ritual and hope. These women brew water-turned potion, and market lodgers pay pennies for each bowlful, served with a wooden dipper. You eye a nearby merchant hawking ginger roots, imported through Italian trading ports, prized for its antimicrobial kick and spicy zing.
Ginger became a luxury spice by the 14th century, but when you add just a few slices to boiling water, you get a warming tonic that fights nausea and purports to scald pathogens to oblivion. You step closer, cradling a freshly carved wooden bowl as the First Lady pours out her rosemary cinnamon infusion. It's a murky amber tide flecked with herb bits, and you lift it to your lips. The taste strikes like a punch-drunk poet. Warm sweetness of cinnamon, piney tickle of rosemary, and a clearing brightness that slithers down your throat, promising calm. You exhale, feeling tension drift away, or maybe that's the alcohol still clinging to your insides from the tavern. Either way, it's better than the musty faucet flavor at home. The third woman gestures to a small mortar and pestle on a stool strewn with marigold petals and bay leaves. She grinds petals and leaf veins into a coarse powder, then whispers a short blessing over it before stirring it into her water. Marigold hushes the fuss, she says. You sip that concoction next, detecting a floral tang and something just shy of earthy bitterness. Marigold and bay were used in medicinal salves, but whether their antiseptic properties really match their folkloric promises is uncertain. Historians still argue whether petal-powered washes ever eliminated more germs than they smothered in scent. A light breeze ruffles the canopy, scattering petals onto the fire embers and sending small flares dancing in the dark. The women steady their ladles, sharing a conspiratorial glance. They swap jokes about noble ladies who spat at their poison chalices when spices ran out. Dry wine, dry humor, they cackle. You laugh softly, reminded of that bard's tale where a duke drew sword over an empty spice sack. Spices weren't just flavoring, they were the only barrier between a dull glug of water and something resembling modern tonic water. You spot a heap of coriander seeds by the third cauldron. The woman places a fistful into her boiling mixture, explaining that coriander's essential oils repel flies and supposedly killed invisible critters. She dips a cloth in the same brew and waves it around the canopy's edges, thinking a mist of spiced steam could sanitize the space. It's like medieval aromatherapy crossed with a DIY bug spray, an intoxicating fog that smells better than the latrine stream you dipped your filter cloth in last night. The smell makes you wonder if you'll ever see water the same way again. You remember the well's algae sheen, the river's fishy swirl, and the cistern's algae tapestry. Now spice-riddled steam floods your senses, calling water a blank canvas for flavor, and maybe for safety. But you can't help but think that these tactics offered more gustatory comfort than actual germicide. Historians still argue whether spices' antibacterial compounds functioned enough at typical medieval concentrations to significantly reduce illness rates. A timid boy approaches, balancing 3 tiny clay cups on a wooden tray. He hands you one of the bowls, jalapeno green water swirling with lemongrass and angelica. You pause, raising the cup like a trophy before tipping your head back for a deliberate gulp. Citrus-like angelica hits first, then a white pepper jolt lingers on your tongue. You frown in surprise. Your sinuses clear while a hint of heat coats your lips. You hiccup and nearly spill a drop on your robes, eliciting peals of laughter from the women. That one wakes the dead, they tease. You retort that you'll need a second round if you expect to finish this pilgrimage without a napkin tattooed on your chin. They refill your bowl, this time with a brew of basil and clove. Cloves, in medieval spice lore, were so coveted that 13th century merchants risked piracy on pressed spice ships. A few clove buds went a long way to mask foul tastes and stifle microbial growth, or at least that was the hope. You sip and feel instant warmth as the clove oil tugs at your gums. It's liquid dentistry without the drill, but whether 2 cloves could truly neutralize waterborne bacteria remains up for debate. Historians still argue whether cloves and other exotic spices provided genuine antimicrobial shields or served mainly to mask rotten flavors. Between sips, you notice steam curling in perfect ribbons above the cauldrons. The women use peacock feathers tied to willow stems to whisk away stray embers, adding a theatrical flourish to a simple craft. You quip that they could start a medieval cooking show. Spice and Sanitation with Lady Thyme comes to mind. They laugh, and one offers you a feather to try. You wave it through the steam, imagining yourself as an ancient influencer remixing rustic DIY with herbal panacea. The feather picks up moisture, beads of spiced water poised like liquid jewels. Night deepens, and firelight flickers against damp stones, throwing long shadows across the lady's work table. You lean against a barrel filled with cold well water set aside for refills. It sloshes softly, a reminder that all these spices and herbs feed on that same muddy source you scooped earlier. You realize you're sampling medieval flavored H2O, a spectrum of tastes masking the core gamble: how to coax safety from murky depths. Before you depart, you ask for a suggestion. What's the most foolproof infusion? They exchange solemn glances, then nod at the basil clove brew. Strongest for the bravest souls. You accept a vial of powdered spice mix to carry home, enough to season a bucket of water for a week. You tuck it into your pouch, thinking of trade routes, thieves, and market gossip about spice price surges that once fueled wars. You step back, blinking at the canopy's glow, and feel a rush of gratitude. These herbal purifiers and spice tactics mixed flavor and sanitation in a single bowlful of hope. You tuck your robes around you against the night's chill and whisper, "Herbal magic might just beat a medieval TikTok trend." The women wave, their smiles warm as embers in the fire. You nod, heart light, senses awakened to the curious cocktail of necessity and human creativity, an age-old recipe still seasoning history.
You follow the lantern-lit path under towering oaks to a distant chapel whose spire slices the night sky like a silent sentinel. Damp moss clings to flagstones as you climb the uneven steps, each one slick with dew. In medieval Europe, pilgrimages to consecrated springs and shrines were common pilgrim undertakings, believed to heal maladies from leprosy to gout and cleanse the soul, sometimes worth weeks of aching feet and days of begging for alms along the way. You inhale the chilly air scented with incense and pine, steeling yourself to sample water that centuries of faith have enshrined. A friar in ebony robes stands beside a carved stone basin fed by a subterranean spring. He greets you with a soft nod and a crooked smile, the hem of his robe whispering across marble. Candlelight flickers off carved angels whose chipped wings echo long-forgotten prayers. You lean in as he uncorks a clay flask, tilting it until a silvery stream trickles into the basin. The water hisses softly as it splashes, like a shy dragon awakening from slumber. Nearby pilgrims hold wooden ladles, dipping and sipping reverently. You grip the edge of the basin, the stone cold and strangely alive under your fingers. A woman in a threadbare cloak turns to you, offering a small wooden cup. "They say this water cured Father Bertram's fever," she murmurs, voice thick with awe. She dips her cup, watching droplets dance like fireflies as they land. You raise an eyebrow. Fevers might have broken naturally by the time he reached the shrine, but the shrine's reputation sparkled enough to draw crowds from miles around. Fringe healers once claimed that chanting psalms over the spring at dawn imbued the water with added potency, a ritual they called aqua veritas, though most baptized folks stuck to silent supplication. Quirky tidbit. You slip into the slow-moving queue, listening to whispered debates. Some pilgrims swear by the water's literal healing power. Others say it's merely a placebo fueled by collective faith. Historians still argue whether miraculous spring cures stemmed from pure belief, naturally occurring mineral content, or clever clerical marketing. The friar gestures for you to step forward, and you feel a flutter in your chest. Your parched throat craves both hydration and divine approval. A hush falls. You kneel at the basin's edge, cupping a palm beneath the spring's mouth. The water glistens as if caught between earth and heaven, swirling with a subtle luminescence you can't tell if it's candle shimmer or mineral sparkle. You lift your hand and bring it to your lips, tasting a crisp chill and a faint whisper of metal, perhaps from local iron deposits. It slips down your throat and settles in your belly like a promise whispered in your ear. Your muscles unknot. This isn't just hydration, it's an embrace from history. The friar intones a quiet blessing, and you glance up through half-lidded eyes. Behind him, a carved panel depicts Saint Bridget slaying serpents with holy water, an image you half remember from an illuminated manuscript. Pilgrims pressed coins into the basin's crevices, believing that small offerings kicked the spring into overdrive, filling bottles and flasks faster for the next thirsty soul. You spot a copper penny wedged between stone and moss, munificence mingling with mossy decay. You offer your own coin, hearing it clink and tumble into the hidden pool below. It disappears instantly, summoning a thrill. You wonder if that sparkle of hope in fellow pilgrims' eyes made the water taste sweeter, or if the minerals really did lend a slight effervescence. A scholarly frown forms. Historians still argue whether the miraculous claims tied to these springs can be traced to trace minerals like magnesium and calcium, or if those elements were just convenient excuses for sold-out services. A cluster of devout women surrounds an altar nearby, chanting psalms as they lift small pitchers of spring water to their foreheads. The chant's low hum resonates against stone walls, vibrating through your bones like distant thunder. You catch yourself humming along, your mind shifting from skeptical wanderer to participant in something ancient and communal. A stray flicker of chapel candlelight reveals spiderwebs draped between pews, reminding you that faith and filth often coexisted in the same space. A curious pilgrim from Ireland offers you a pinch of holy mud scooped from the basin's bank, insisting you smear it on your temples to ward off headaches. You laugh softly, picturing medieval Facebook status updates. Applying mud filter to cleanse worries. #Holy Spa Day. You smear a speck of the damp clay onto your brow. It's cold, gritty, oddly soothing. The friar raises an eyebrow, but says nothing. You wonder whether that mud offered any antiseptic value, or whether it was simply another layer of faith-driven placebo. Historians still argue whether these mud cures held any genuine medicinal merit or served only to deepen pilgrims' devotion. You dip the wooden ladle back into the basin for a second sip. This time, you taste a hint of sage from nearby herb bundles hung to bless the water. Locals sometimes stuffed rosemary and basil branches into the spring's channel, believing that aromatic oils would blend in to deliver herbal blessings. Whether those aromas masked foul tastes or actually held antiseptic properties remains a matter of debate among scholars. Nevertheless, the mingled scents make you breathe easier, imagining you're inhaling both summer fields and winter chapels. A friar in training emerges from a spiral stair, carrying an iron-bound chest of small alabaster bottles. He rings a tiny bell, beckoning pilgrims to purchase blessed vials for minimal coin. "For water on the road," he explains, his voice echoing like a solemn bell. The alabaster glows softly, translucent as moonlight, promising portability for spiritual refreshment. You eye your own flask, thinking how modern travelers lug stainless steel flasks, but medieval folk prized alabaster's holy glow, convinced it preserved sanctity. You fork over a few copper pennies and receive a bottle the size of your thumb. The friar secures the cork with wax and stamps it with the order's seal, a crude insignia of 2 crossed keys. You tuck the bottle into your breast pocket, right next to the pouch of spice mix from the herbalists. Both feel like potent charms against unseen threats. You imagine whipping out that little flask when thirst hits on the morrow, Henry VIII-style holy water aside in one hand, homemade filter water in the other. A pilgrim couple from Burgundy invites you to join a prayer circle. You accept, standing in a ring of bowed heads and clasped hands. They offer you a sprig of consecrated rosemary to brush against your lips before your next sip, a ritual you've seen embroidered in psalters but never practiced yourself. You take the sprig, sniffing the faint fragrance of oak smoke and olive groves. They gesture for you to breathe it in, then to dip it into the spring, a poetic touch that melds olive branch peace with alpine scent.
You salute the basin one last time and step back. The friar recites a final blessing, and you feel a warmth in your chest, as if the chapel's stones themselves echoed approval. Outside, the night air feels softer, as though filtered through centuries of whispered prayers. You slip into the dark lane, balancing your chalice of faith and flasks of filtered and cistern water, each competing for loyalty in your thirst-quenching arsenal. As you depart, you glance back at the chapel's glowing windows, imagining the light as both beacon and warning. Faith can heal, but water remains water. You think of the grandmother warning about cow dung by the river, the carbone filter tinkerer, and the spice herbalists, each promising safety in their own way. You pat your pocket where the alabaster bottle rests, a holy backup plan between you and any rogue bacteria that dare cross your path. Your footsteps echo until the chapel fades behind trees. You breathe deeply, tasting the spring's promise still lingering on your tongue. You realize that medieval people balanced faith, folklore, and fledgling science in a single sip, creating rituals that shaped mind and body alike. With each careful cup, they sought control in an uncontrollable world, proof that even in uncertainty, humanity's thirst for safety never dwindled.
You leave the hush of the chapel's stone steps behind, torchlight and incense fading into the night breeze as you tread narrow alleys toward the town's outskirts. The cobbles beneath your boots, slick with evening dew, transform into rough-hewn flagstones studded with dripping moss. A sharp, acrid scent, like burnt hair mixed with sour milk, slips through the air, nudging your nostrils awake. You're approaching the public latrines and sewer outlets where medieval waste disposal met waterways, and every drop you once trusted quivers with potential betrayal. Up ahead, a low-roofed structure stands on wooden stilts above a shallow trench. Inside, the latrine consists of bench-like seats cut from worn planks, each hole offering a view of the gutter below. The whole building leans slightly, as if considering a faceplant into its own contents. You step closer and hear the muffled symphony of human calls of nature, punctuated by the drip, drip, drip of liquid landing in stagnant water. Medieval towns often positioned latrines over open channels that carried excrement toward rivers or cesspits, forming one of Europe's earliest sewer networks borrowed from Roman engineering principles. Mainstream fact. You swallow, letting your tongue skim the back of your throat, an ASMR prickling that's more cringe than comfort. A rat rustles beneath a bench, snagging a scrap of linen discarded by a careless user. You wince, picturing a rat's whiskers flicking across your ankles as you hover over the next seat. You remind yourself that these structures were social hubs, places where villagers met for gossip, barter, and even clandestine love notes carved into wooden planks. You run your fingers along the seat's edge, feeling grooves carved by countless elbows propped in conversation. This is where communal rumor stank just as badly as the waste below. Moving down the trench, you spot open drains carved from stone, leading away from the latrine toward a larger conduit. The conduit's sides are slick with greenish algae, echoes of that cistern bloom and well's slimy lip, beckoning microscopic hitchhikers along every inch of the channel. You hear whispers that city authorities sometimes dumped ash or broken pottery shards into sewers to slow the flow, hoping solids would settle before reaching drinking springs. Historians still argue whether these early sedimentation tactics offered any real improvement, or simply aggregated blockages that needed manual unclogging. A gust of wind carries the scent of fermenting barley from a nearby brewery, mingling with latrine fumes into a foul bouquet you can't unsmell. You catch a flash of moonlight glinting off a dripping sewer grate anchored in the middle of the lane. It sits flush with the stones, a slick iron patch riddled with holes. You lean closer, peering at the darkness below. Water gurgles somewhere deep beneath, carrying tales of livestock waste, household runoff, and who knows what else.
You imagine the riverbank back at Lamay, where cows crossed upstream. Here, those same hoofprints end up in narrow pipes heading straight for the community's water supply. A lantern bearer approaches, tipping his lamp so you can avoid stepping into a shallow pool of yellow-brown ooze. He nods politely, but flicks his eyes away as if embarrassed by his own route. You murmur a greeting and ask about the sewer's construction. He shrugs and says the city once hired a master mason to rebuild the main conduit with half-baked bricks waterproofed by fish oil, a recipe drawn from coastal ports. You wrinkle your nose. Fish oil might stave off leaks, but it also perfumes the air with rancid undertones, wedging itself between every breath. You continue along the trench, boots clicking at uneven intervals. Beneath iron grates at street corners, you glimpse flickers of life. A pale fish darting in the slow current, tadpoles, remember those from the well, and a lone crayfish pinching an oozing plastic bag that drifted in from the marketplace. You shudder at the collision of organic and human detritus, realizing that these channels were not just wasteways, but unintended aquariums showcasing medieval water's full menace. A stone arch spans the trench, supporting a small bridge so folks can cross without dancing around open pits. You step onto it, leaning on the mossy rail, and listen to that wet orchestra of drips. Somewhere downstream, the sewer water spills into a canal that feeds the town's dyeing mills, where woolens soak in vats of madder and woad. You imagine purple-dyed cloth splashing into the ether, mingling with human excrement, before flowing further to fertilize fields or into the river, depending on vanishing acts of daylight. You crouch beside a short section of exposed gutter and dip a finger into its surface tension. The liquid clings between your fingers like thick honey gone bad, leaving a slimy sheen you scrub on your robe. A memory flickers of the charcoal filter cottage. Could any filter pot handle this sludge? The notion feels absurd, like trying to sieve cartwheel spokes. You taste the faint tang. Nothing herbal can mask that. Moving down the trench, you spot open drains carved from stone, leading away from the latrine toward a larger conduit. The conduit's sides are slick with greenish algae, echoes of that cistern bloom and well's slimy lip, beckoning microscopic hitchhikers along every inch of the channel. You hear whispers that city authorities sometimes dumped ash or broken pottery shards into sewers to slow the flow, hoping solids would settle before reaching drinking springs. Historians still argue whether these early sedimentation tactics offered any real improvement or simply aggregated blockages that needed manual unclogging. A gust of wind carries the scent of fermenting barley from a nearby brewery, mingling with latrine fumes into a foul bouquet you can't unsmell. You catch a flash of moonlight glinting off a dripping sewer grate anchored in the middle of the lane. It sits flush with the stones, a slick iron patch riddled with holes. You lean closer, peering at the darkness below. Water gurgles somewhere deep beneath, carrying tales of livestock waste, household runoff, and who knows what else. You imagine the riverbank back at Lamay, where cows crossed upstream. Here, those same hoofprints end up in narrow pipes, heading straight for the community's water supply. A lantern bearer approaches, tipping his lamp so you can avoid stepping into a shallow pool of yellow-brown ooze. He nods politely, but flicks his eyes away as if embarrassed by his own route. You murmur a greeting and ask about the sewer's construction. He shrugs and says the city once hired a master mason to rebuild the main conduit with half-baked bricks waterproofed by fish oil, a recipe drawn from coastal ports. You wrinkle your nose. Fish oil might stave off leaks, but it also perfumes the air with rancid undertones, wedging itself between every breath. You continue along the trench, boots clicking at uneven intervals. Beneath iron grates at street corners, you glimpse flickers of life. A pale fish darting in the slow current, tadpoles, remember those from the well, and a lone crayfish pinching an oozing plastic bag that drifted in from the marketplace. You shudder at the collision of organic and human detritus, realizing that these channels were not just wasteways, but unintended aquariums showcasing medieval water's full menace. A stone arch spans the trench, supporting a small bridge so folks can cross without dancing around open pits. You step onto it, leaning on the mossy rail, and listen to that wet orchestra of drips. Somewhere downstream, the sewer water spills into a canal that feeds the town's dyeing mills, where woolens soak in vats of madder and woad. You imagine purple-dyed cloth splashing into the ether, mingling with human excrement, before flowing further to fertilize fields or into the river, depending on vanishing acts of daylight. You crouch beside a short section of exposed gutter and dip a finger into its surface tension. The liquid clings between your fingers like thick honey gone bad, leaving a slimy sheen you scrub on your robe. A memory flickers of the charcoal filter cottage. Could any filter pot handle this sludge? The notion feels absurd, like trying to sieve cartwheel spokes. You taste the faint tang. Nothing herbal can mask that. Moving down the trench, you spot open drains carved from stone, leading away from the latrine toward a larger conduit. The conduit's sides are slick with greenish algae, echoes of that cistern bloom and slimy lip, beckoning microscopic hitchhikers along every inch of the channel. You hear whispers that city authorities sometimes dumped ash or broken pottery shards into sewers, hoping solids would settle before reaching drinking springs. Historians still argue whether these early sedimentation tactics offered any real improvement or simply aggregated blockages that needed manual unclogging. A gust of wind carries the scent of fermenting barley from a nearby brewery, mingling with latrine fumes into a foul bouquet you can't unsmell. You catch a flash of moonlight glinting off a dripping sewer grate anchored in the middle of the lane. It sits flush with the stones, a slick iron patch riddled with holes. You lean closer, peering at the darkness below. Water gurgles somewhere deep beneath, carrying tales of livestock waste, household runoff, and who knows what else. You imagine the riverbank back at Lamay, where cows crossed upstream. Here, those same hoofprints end up in narrow pipes, heading straight for the community's water supply.
You step away from the docks and trudge up the cobblestone lane toward the village green, jugs sloshing with that reassuring spring water. Above you, lanterns glow like fireflies captured in glass. Yet, in hushed tones, villagers confess a creeping fear. Whispers of sudden fevers and bloody diarrhea striking households fed by the same streams you once sampled. Waterborne outbreaks were common in medieval towns, sweeping through families like a grim tide, with dysentery and what passed for cholera claiming lives within days. Mainstream fact. You pause, hand on your jug's curved shoulder, half expecting to hear the old grandmother's warning echo back. One bad sip and you're in the stew pot. A woman in a stained apron passes by, clutching a ragged child to her chest. He gasps between sobs, eyes glazed like overboiled eggs. You kneel, offering your filtered water flask as if it's a life raft in a microbial ocean. The mother gently declines, murmuring she's heard of a fringe remedy that uses powdered serpent scales from a traveling alchemist, supposed to banish toxins from the gut. You can't tell if it's worse than the disease. Serpent scales? That sounds like medieval cocktail party gossip, perhaps trending among charlatans flogging snake oil by the roadside. Quirky tidbit. The child whimpers, and you empty a gulp into his trembling lips. Relief flickers across his face, though it could be placebo or genuine rescue. Historians still argue whether such primitive treatments ever truly helped, or simply bolstered familial hope until nature ran its course. You wonder if that hope tastes sweeter than your filtered water, or if it's just heartbreak flavored by desperation. You rise, carrying your jugs like weighted promises, and enter the shadowy marketplace. A cluster of villagers gathers around a makeshift bulletin board, scrawled with crayon-esque warnings. Avoid East Stream until further notice, and boil before you bubble.
Beneath that, someone has doodled a smiling frog wearing a crown, an apparent nod to the frog saliva myth you heard in Section 1. You snort softly. Medieval graffiti always carries that uncanny mix of humor and dread. One elderly apothecary sets up shop beside a trough, offering cups of weak chamomile tea steeped in honey. She claims chamomile's antimicrobial flavonoids ease intestinal cramps and gently soothe upset tummies, a soothing salve in an age of gritty remedies. You cup a bowl to your lips, inhaling that soft floral sweetness. It tastes of pillow fluff and bedtime stories, an ASMR lullaby for your gut. Yet you recall reading that chamomile in medieval Europe was often adulterated with mugwort or mustard seeds to bulk up stock, resulting in surprise nose twitching at every sip. Historians still argue whether these adulterated teas did more harm than good, or simply served as early forms of calorie-dense sustenance. A teenage boy races past you, clutching a vinegar-soaked rag to his nose. He's faintly pale, but too stubborn to stop his errands. The vinegar's sharp tang stings your nostrils, a reminder that medieval vinegar baths were hailed as disinfectants. Vinegar-soaked cloth spread over contaminated kitchenware, door handles, and even surfaces of bread before sale. You wrinkle your nose at the memory of your own vinegar wooden spoon rents back in Section 4, picturing your future self gargling pickles. It's sort of like medieval hand sanitizer if people hadn't come up with soap yet. You follow the boy's path to the east stream you once skirted in Section 2. Now barricades of sandbags and cartwheels declare quarantine zone, their crude red crosses painted with hurried brushstrokes. A pair of guards in mismatched armor huddled under a half-rotten canopy, offering boiled ale to travelers instead of water. It sounds oddly generous, until you realize boiled ale was as safe as medieval water got, but still left you feeling like you'd traded waterborne nausea for a mild hangover. Mainstream fact. You flash them a tired grin and accept a mug, the foam clinging to your fingers like foam from a failed beard dye. You swallow deeply, tasting familiar toasted grains and a sour note that's downright medieval. You note the amber color, darker than your tavern brew in Section 5, indicating extra boil time, or perhaps extra barley husks dropped in to thicken the stew. You suppose, either way, it's better than the East Stream's microbial roulette. Nearby, a scribe scrawls daily death tolls onto a scrap of parchment. 5 more lost since dawn. The letters wobble under candlelight, each stroke a testament to communal grief. You swallow, adjusting the weight of your jugs on your shoulders. You think about the community's reliance on shared water sources, wells, cisterns, rivers, and how a single infection could spread like wildfire through any of them. Historians still argue whether medieval authorities recognized water as the primary vector, or blamed miasmatic bad air, delaying effective intervention. A laborer hauls ashes from the local tannery, pouring them into a barrel of rainwater destined for clean floors. You watch ash clouds swirl into the water, creating a ghostly haze. Medieval blacksmiths and tanners sometimes used wood ashes to raise alkalinity, a crude lye substitute for cleaning pots and even disinfecting garments. You imagine wringing out a pair of socks in alkali water. Your modern laundry cycle suddenly seems like pampered luxury. Beyond the quarantine camp, you spot a lean vintner in dusty robes stirring a gargantuan vat of swirling red wine mixed with boiled water. He claims that mixing wine and water at high heat created a sanitizing steamer, vinous vapor he calls it, used to fumigate rooms and tools. You grin at the notion. Medieval hot toddy meets industrial steam cleaner. Fringe engineers of the era swore this vapor killed fleas and foul airs, though critics said it functioned more like aromatherapy than actual plague prevention. You slip away from the plague camp's chaotic bustle and head toward the priest's infirmary at the abbey gates. The scent of incense and bandages drifts to greet you, tangy like a church kitchen gone wrong. Inside, you're handed a wooden bowl laced with broth and vervain tea. The broth tastes thinner than the tavern's hearty version, likely boiled with water deemed too risky for direct consumption. You sip warily, the liquid scratching your throat but offering a sliver of solace. The sisters, murmuring prayers, insist that soaking bread in that broth twice removes disease at both ends. You quiet a giggle. If only modern health advice had embraced that bi-directional approach. A leper leans into you towards you, his cheek mottled, but eyes bright as embers. He grips your elbow, whispering that he's lived through 4 outbreaks thanks to daily dabs of burnt frankincense on his water skin. Another fringe practice claiming incense smoke repelled plague-carrying rodents. You give him a respectful nod, though you suspect the soothing scent did more for morale than germ control. Historians still argue whether incense's antimicrobial oils had any substantive impact on medieval disease rates, or if they simply masked stench and fear. Stepping back into the twilight outside the abbey walls, you lug your jugs toward home, every echo of your boots a metronome for mortality. You catch a whiff of damp straw from the infirmary beds, mingling with the spring's fresher aroma. It reminds you that medieval communities blended practical measures, boiling, brewing, filtering, with rituals of faith and fringe remedies, hoping to stem outbreaks that modern medicine would only understand centuries later. Finally, you reach your doorstep, jugs centered on the worn threshold. You pause, observing how shadow and lamplight pool together, forming shapes as unpredictable as a plague spread. You exhale, shoulder tension easing as you recount your resources. Spring water for drinking, filtered water for cooking, boiled ale for emergencies, herbal teas for comfort, and holy water for spiritual insurance. You lift one jug and tip it for a cautious sip. Untouched spring water, clean as you've ever known in these plague-haunted times. It glides down your throat, a whisper of reassurance. You murmur to yourself, "May your microbes stay at bay," and pat the jug's clay side like an old friend that never tells your secrets. Then you turn the key, cross the threshold, and leave the lords and laborers to wrestle with contagion in the dark.
You close the heavy wooden door behind you, the echo of hinges fading into the hush of your hearth-lit kitchen. Candlelight dances across oak beams, illuminating half-empty clay jugs lined on a rickety shelf. You breathe in the faint tang of damp stone and leftover barley mash, mindful that every container here holds a gamble in liquid form. Medieval healers sometimes recommended washing water vessels with stale urine for its ammonia-based disinfecting properties, scrubbing away grime and microbial dread before refilling them with spring or cistern water. You glance at a stained basin by the hearth, the very tool of this practice, and wonder if ammonia really chased germs or simply chased away faint-hearted skeptics. Your eyes settle on a cracked jug, still streaked with dried donkey urine residue, the latest fringe filter your neighbor swears by. He claimed donkey urine neutralized toxic humors, pouring a cupful through sand and charcoal layers to activate disinfection, though the drainage left behind a bitter aftertaste and scandalized his cat. You tip the jug so a few droplets fall into a shallow pan, watching them hiss softly as they mingle with soot and sediment. It's a quirky trick that walks the line between alchemy and alchemy's less glamorous cousin, lacto-fetid chemistry. You suppress a laugh at the image of medieval filter influencers hawking donkey urine tonic on market days. Tonight, you set aside that jug and retrieve a small leather pouch filled with moon-dusted charms. You wander into the courtyard beneath a silvered sky, turning the pouch thrice around your head before kneeling to bury an earthenware cup under a gibbous moon. Elders insisted that lunar phases infused water with celestial purity if left overnight in unbroken clay, an age-old charm of lunar hydrology. Historians still argue whether burying water under the full moon did anything more than boost morale, or if cosmic blessings truly mingled with the liquid's molecules under moonlight's gaze. Returning inside, you rub a pomander of crushed juniper berries and crowfoot petals across each jug's rim, murmuring a blessing taught by a traveling apothecary. Rabbit's foot talismans dangle from the pantry latch, a token meant to repel sickness and ensure steady supply. Fringe lore claimed that touching a rabbit's foot on a water skin confers the creature's agility upon those who drink,
though most medics rolled their eyes at mixing charms and chalices in one gulp. You hang the talismans above your storage shelf, the beads clicking like shy laughter at superstition's doorstep. You fetch a wooden dipper and stir your newest potion, cold spring water infused with a pinch of crushed ackee bone, believed by some to anchor excess humors, plus a sliver of dyed viper's flesh salvaged from a healer's jar. The concoction exudes a curious rainbow sheen and a faint metallic whisper. You swirl the liquid in the dipper, noting the slight grit at the bottom that escaped your makeshift sediment trap. You flick the dregs off with a wooden scraper, convinced that bone fragments might fortify your bones more than they threaten your gut. A battered leather scroll pinned near the hearth catches your eye. It lists cures both noble and ridiculous. To banish dropsy, fast 3 days and bathe in rainwater collected from oak leaves. To prevent fevers, hang a weasel tooth above the jug. And, to cure waterborne plague, consume 3 spoons of burnt cat whiskers. You shake your head, amused and uneasy at how fear and hope spawned this motley pharmacopoeia. Yet you can't deny that in a world without microscopes, belief often felt like the finest filter of all. You decide to test one last superstition, the Rind or Pyrrhus-inspired egg ritual you read about in a traveler's account. You crack a fresh hen's egg into a glass flask of cistern water, swirling until the white coagulates and clings to the sides. Folk healers claimed that egg white coagulation trapped toxins, sinking them to the bottom where they could be decanted off. You let the flask sit by the fire's glow, watching the clear separation of golden yolk and cloudy liquid, almost poetic, like molten stained glass. Whether it truly purified water or merely entertained hopeful households remains a matter of debate, though some practical cooks turned to egg whites for clarifying mead and wine as early as the 13th century. Hunger pangs interrupt your ritual, reminding you that every container of water also fuels your evening porridge. You haul a heavy kettle onto the hearth and fill it with filtered water, setting oats and dried fruits to soften in the gentle boil. Steam curls upward, scented with almond and sweetness, masking any residue from last night's donkey urine experiment. The kettle's hiss feels like an ASMR lullaby, bridging superstition and sustenance in one soothing note. As the porridge simmers, you stir in a spoonful of powdered marigold petals and a pinch of sage, recalling the herbalist's remedies for calming digestive storms. Medieval cooks often used such petals both to flavor and to charm water, believing that marigold's antiseptic oils bolstered purity. You taste a petal shard, its flavor grassy and bright like dawn meadows. You marvel at how wildly people jammed petals, bones, and pea into their water, and how these rituals coaxed confidence into each sip more effectively than any sealed barrel. Your porridge done, you ladle it into a deep wooden bowl and drizzle honeyed al reduction over the top, an indulgence to celebrate another day survived without succumbing to hidden hydra of bacteria. You tuck into the warm meal, feeling the silky oats coat your throat, chased by a cinnamon-spiced echo from your spice reserve. The rabbit's foot talisman on the wall catches stray candlelight, bouncing specks of reassurance around the room. You pat your belly and think, medieval cures might straddle sense and silliness, but they offered both flavor and faith in a single bowlful. Night deepens as you rise to gather your jugs, the smoky aroma of hearth embers trailing behind. You move to your sleeping chamber, handing a small flask of moon-blessed water to a wooden stand by your pillow. You whisper a final charm over it, old words about warding off nightmares and microbial mischief. Leaning back, you glance at your collection, vials of filtered, lunar-infused, spice-laced, and egg-clarified water, each promising its own brand of protection against murky threats. You slip under coarse wool blankets, the rough fibers scratching comforting patterns against your skin. The room's shadows stretch and sway, as if murmuring tales of donkey urine washes and rabbit's foot blessings. You close your eyes, tasting the echo of juniper-spiced porridge and moon water on your lips. In the quiet hum that follows, you acknowledge that medieval people blended superstition, chemistry, and sheer nerve into every cup, a curious cocktail that let them drown out fear, one ritual at a time.
You trudge down the sun-baked lane toward the town's main fountain, jugs sloshing at your sides and sweat beading on your forehead like raindrops before a storm. A stout wooden toll booth stands guard beneath a rattling banner, its post carved with symbols of a crowned crown and a twisted fish, for here water is more precious than coin. You halt as the water bailiff tips his wide-brimmed hat, his leather pouch swinging with the promise of fees. In medieval Europe, you learn, towns and lords often imposed water tolls on wells, fountains, and river withdrawals, charging merchants by the barrel and peasants by the bucket to fund communal maintenance and guard against overuse, mainstream fact. You clench your knuckles around your jugs, bracing to lighten your pockets in exchange for a few precious liters. The bailiff's booth smells of damp wood and tobacco smoke, a faint warning that governance carried both civic duty and personal profit. He sizes you up, peering from beneath bristled brows, then proffers a tin token stamped with the town's insignia. You slide him a silver penny, watching his fingers brush yours as if forging a tenuous alliance. Toll tokens weren't just revenue, they were passports to water security, trade privilege, and, sometimes, social standing. You swallow, noting that wealthy merchants often bought yearly water passes, affording them unlimited access, while you and your neighbors scraped by on daily tokens. The bailiff tips his head toward the fountain's stone basin, where children clamor with chipped mugs and chipped teeth. A boy with a herringbone cap swipes your elbow, nearly tipping your jugs, and grins as if you were a walking water carnival. You laugh softly, but your heart thumps. One handful of water cost a day's wage for a laborer here, and saving up coins meant skipping meals or trading eggs at market. You recall the corvée laborers who once rebuilt the town's aqueduct arches, carrying stones in exchange for a single bucket's free draw, a bargain that left them wheezing but thirsty for more equitable terms. Beyond the fountain, you notice gated sluice channels carved into low stone parapets. Guards stand at each channel's end, monitoring the sluices that feed private mills and bathhouses. A carved sign reads, "Authorized users only," an exclusive privilege sealed with iron grates and gold-lettered charters. You peer through the slats, imagining the lavish bathhouse draped in silk towels, where nobles bathed in scented waters daily, while commoners queued for a trickle from the public tap. You swallow the bitter edge of inequality, aware that water governance wasn't merely about pipes and pumps, it was about power, status, and keeping the masses keenly aware of their place. A sudden shriek draws your gaze to a narrow alley where two townsfolk argue in hushed urgency. One man points at the bailiff's booth, accusing him of raising fees without consent. The other fumes that the Lord's exchequer needed silver for castle repairs. You edge closer and hear the words injustice and bread and water rights tossed like hot stones. You quip under your breath. Medieval protests must have looked like modern budget debates, only with more tunics and fewer microphones. You follow the alley to a small gathering under a half-collapsed archway. Lanterns swing from iron hooks, their glow revealing half a dozen faces etched with worry. A woman in a soot-streaked apron holds a crudely painted placard. "Aqua Libertas," she proclaims. A lanky apprentice nods, clutching a scrap of parchment, the charter that granted free fountain access to townsfolk generations ago, now torn by a hastily inked surcharge decree. The group debates whether water tolls have strayed from communal upkeep into oppressive tax farming. Historians still argue whether these water levies actually financed better infrastructure or merely padded pockets of local elites. You lean in, curiosity flickering, then a stray breeze wafts in the smell of rotting apples from a nearby orchard. A fringe storyteller pipes up about a secret society of water wights, fabled spirits demanding coin or mischief,
tipping the scales whenever tolls rose beyond 1 farthing. He claims villagers once left offerings of honey cakes at the fountain's base to placate these invisible gatekeepers, an odd pixie taxation if ever you heard one. You laugh softly at the image of ethereal bounties vanishing overnight, only to be blamed on phantom auditors or drunken youths. The discussion grows heated. One man paces, citing recent floods that cracked fountain tiles. Another argues that sluice taxes funded essential repairs. You lean against a cool stone pillar, thinking how water governance hinged on both trust and transparency, two things in alarming short supply. You recall your own experience at the cistern and well, where communal bonds kept wells clean more than any official decree. Now, under the arch's flickering lamplight, you sense that solidarity often clashed with authority, birthing protests small and large. A whisper runs through the crowd. A local lord's decree will be announced at dawn. They plan to hike the water toll by half a penny per bucket, citing castle embellishments and defensive moat maintenance. Your brow furrows. Defensive moats. That day's water tax would wrap around the castle walls but choke your family's wells. The townsfolk exchange glances like flickering candle flames, each gaze a silent promise that injustice need not pass without censure. You decide to linger until the decree's read from the Lord's balcony, a makeshift pulpit overlooking the fountain. Soon, a herald in midnight blue tunic climbs the steps, unfurling a parchment with the Lord's wax seal. His voice rumbles. By order of Lord Reynard, tolls henceforth shall be increased to support the war effort and the beautification of the castle gardens. Gasps ripple through the crowd. A child lets out a mournful cry as her mother clutches her arm. In an instant, the rumble of dissent rises like tidal waters. Shouts of "unfair" and "our water too" clash with the herald's clarion calls. The bailiff emerges, face ashen, trying to calm the swarm, but the crowd surges forward. You feel yourself swept in, the press of humanity warm and urgent. Someone kicks a wooden stool. It thuds against the fountain's curb, sending droplets into the air like muddy fireworks. Moments later, you find yourself at the heart of the uproar, urging patience in a voice soft as twilight. But the crowd's thirst for justice is sharper than any velvet murmur. A few stones fling through the air, clattering on stone steps. In the chaos, you glimpse the bailiff's hat tumbling over the curb, rolling into the fountain with a splash. You stifle a gasp, the symbol of authority drenched in public water. Before the revolt can tip into violence, a warder's horn blasts from the gate, calling for order. Town guards line the plaza, halberds glinting like sunlit spears. The crowd freezes. A hush falls, as eerie as moonlight over a grave. The Lord Steward steps forward, voice laced with steel. Return to your homes. Tomorrow you may send representatives to petition the council. It's a half promise, but enough to diffuse the rising tide. Reluctantly, shouting villagers drift away, leaving broken tokens scattered like regrets around the fountain's lip. You gather your jugs, weighing the cost of revolt against the necessity of water. You bend to retrieve your spilled token, a tin disc engraved with that staring fish. Holding it in your palm, you feel its cold weight and wonder if someday it might buy more than a few drops. As you emerge from the square, lantern fades behind you, replaced by the chorus of frogs in the moat and the steady drip of distant cisterns. Your footsteps echo against shuttered stalls. The riot's adrenaline ebbs, leaving a hollow ache in your chest. You breathe deeply, tasting the night air, simultaneously sweet with anticipation for tomorrow's council and bitter with the knowledge that governance and access to life's basic resource can twist social bonds. You glance at your water jugs, their liquid content a reminder that every sip carries the echoes of politics, protest, and patience. You smile wryly, thinking that even after a revolt, tomorrow you might still trudge back to the toll booth, purse lighter, hope heavier.
You slip away from the anguished crowd at dawn, jugs strapped to your hips as the palace silhouette softens in early light. Cobblestones give way to waving grasses as you follow a narrow track toward the old aqueduct that arches across the valley. Each time you've passed below its stone ribs, you've felt the ancient pulse of water held aloft, humming through channels carved by master masons centuries ago. Medieval aqueducts, drawing inspiration from Roman engineering, carried spring water across miles to fountains, baths, and castle ramparts, a feat of gravity and geometry as precise as any clockwork mechanism. You trail your fingers along the cool limestone, savoring the faint grit beneath your nails and the soft echo of dripping dew. You crouch beneath one arch and listen, a distant plash, like a muted waterfall, beckoning from the aqueduct's crest. The sound ripples through the columns, creating an ASMR cathedral of water in flight. You lean your head back and taste the mist, tangy with morning freshness and a metallic whisper that might be the signature of lead pipes at the far end. Once water spills from these vines of stone, it passes through networks of wooden channels or lengthwise hollowed logs sealed with pitch. Then, for the grand finale, it courses into lead pipes lined beneath castle walls, ready for princely baths and elite fountains. You stand and climb the weathered steps that spiral beside one pillar, each ascent bringing the aqueduct's trough into view. Moss mats cushion your boots, releasing earthy scents as you step. Up here, sunlight slants through ivy-framed arches, illuminating the water's glassy sheen. You kneel at the channel and peer in, seeing thin ribbons of water glimmer like quicksilver. A medieval servant might have checked this flow daily, sliding a wooden paddle to measure depth, ensuring constant supply to thirsty lords. You dip your finger, tasting cool clarity, yet you sniff a faint oily note from the pipe joints, a telltale hint of pitch sealant and maybe a trace of metal. You shiver with delight and dread. At the aqueduct's terminus, water tumbles into a lead-lined cistern built beneath the castle keep. You step inside the vaulted chamber, echoing like a limestone flute. The air here tastes faintly sweet, as if the stone itself exhaled mineral dust. You run your hand over a lead pipe joint, the metal smooth as butter, but heavy with stories of accidental poisoning. Lead, praised for its malleability and resistance to corrosion, found its way into countless pipe systems by the 12th century. Some cast copper alloy fittings, even mixed lead with tin for durability. Yet later scholars accused this metal marvel of unleashing insidious mercury-like decay in noble minds. Historians still argue whether lead poisoning truly plagued medieval elites, or if those tales were exaggerations penned by politically motivated critics. You crouch beside the cistern and trace a carved inscription near its basin, a pair of overflowing chalices flanked by a knight's helm. The mason's trademark, dating from the late 13th century, signals both pride in the structure and an almost holy reverence for the water it housed. Yet you spot an odd repair, a short segment of sheep's bladder wrapped around a joint beneath the inscription, fastened with rough hemp twine. Fringe carpenters sometimes used dried bladders as primitive gaskets, convinced the animal's own elasticity formed a better seal than rope alone. You touch the bladder, parchment thin and brittle, imagining it expanded upon contact with water, sealing leaks like living caulking. A distant rumble pulls your gaze to the battlements above. You wonder if drilling holes in aqueduct stones to support bird perches was technique or oversight, granting sparrows free rein to dip beaks and chip at the trough's lining. You shake your head at nature's tiny engineers, buzzing across medieval infrastructure without permits or fees. You sip fresh water from your flask, noting the difference. This aqueduct water feels fuller, richer than the spring alone, perhaps tinted by its slow pilgrimage through stone, lead, and bladders. You emerge into sunlight again, scaling a narrow ladder toward the castle's infirmary ward.
An elderly surgeon awaits, his sleeve rolled to reveal veins like braided ropes. He beckons you over to a wash basin fed by a narrow lead spur from the cistern. He dabs a linen cloth in the water and squeezes it over a patient's wound, hot tea infused with horse chestnut. You watch rivulets course down the basin's grooves, imagining how the same water once gurgled through hollowed logs and aqueduct channels. He grimaces at the tingling chill on his skin and remarks that lead-laden water offers no advantage for wound care, toughening tissue rather than cleansing it. Historians still argue whether the medieval use of lead pipes caused more harm than the diseases they inadvertently courted. You follow the surgeon down a stone corridor where hidden pipes run behind walls. Lead noise resonates at odd intervals. Taps and joints creak like ancient violin strings. You pause in a shadowed niche and place your ear against a pipe. The water's gurgle is damp and muted, a lullaby of circulation that once kept castle kitchens brewing fine soups and royal baths steaming. The tunnel smells of damp mortar and aging metal, a potpourri that speaks of corridors forgotten by most guests. You trace the pipe's curve with a fingertip, feeling the chill of cold water meeting lead. The corridor opens onto a privy tower, its oak trapdoor swinging on iron hinges. You step inside. The chamber smells like concentrated compost and straw. A bench runs along the wall, each seat bored with a neat opening above a vertical shaft. At the bottom, you hear water dripping onto a stone sump, carried away through another pipe network into the moat below. Privy lines such as these, flush systems fueled by diverted cistern water, offered some privacy and sanitation in wealthier castles, though they also risked backflow if blocked by straw and stone. You hover your hand above one seat and detect a cool draft, a tiny breeze drawn up by the moat's open water, a subtle reminder that waste and water supply systems often shared hidden arteries. You peer down the shaft, glimpsing light where it meets the moat's surface far below. How many times have you whispered a prayer of relief here, trusting that water would whisk away your indiscretions rather than linger around your ankles? You toss a small twig to gauge speed. It disappears almost instantly. The flush lulls you into a weird comfort, albeit one tinged with faint horror at the thought of medieval plumbers caught unawares, replaced by someone brave enough to ascend the tower's wooden ladder to clear clogs. You step back onto the castle ramparts, where fountains sparkle in the courtyard below. In their marble basins, water spills over carved lion heads, singing summer songs beneath turrets. Noble guests pinch their noses to watch the dance of droplets, confident this lead-kissed water tastes sweeter than any spring. You suppress a wry smile, recalling the toddler's game in Section 2, spotting tadpoles in every basin. Now those basins gleam under noble fingertips, the same water that threaded through aqueducts, filters, and privy lines. You trace the fountain's lip with your finger, noting its faint copper-green patina, an alchemy of metal, mineral, and stone. You lean over and take a careful sip from your flask. Filtered, cistern, aqueduct, and spring water mingled in your memories. You ponder the debate. Did lead rings in the pipe slowly leach poisons into medieval minds, or did simple daily exposure harden kingdoms against unseen threats? Historians still argue whether lead-related ailments in medieval elites shaped political decisions, or if later chroniclers exaggerated those malaises for literary flair. You crouch beside the cistern and trace a carved inscription near its basin, a pair of overflowing chalices flanked by a knight's helm. The mason's trademark, dating from the late 13th century, signals both pride in the structure and an almost holy reverence for the water it housed. Yet you spot an odd repair, a short segment of sheep's bladder wrapped around a joint beneath the inscription, fastened with rough hemp twine. Fringe carpenters sometimes used dried bladders as primitive gaskets, convinced the animal's own elasticity formed a better seal than rope alone. You touch the bladder, parchment thin and brittle, imagining it expanded upon contact with water, sealing leaks like living caulking. A distant rumble pulls your gaze to the battlements above. You wonder if drilling holes in aqueduct stones to support bird perches was technique or oversight, granting sparrows free rein to dip beaks and chip at the trough's lining. You shake your head at nature's tiny engineers, buzzing across medieval infrastructure without permits or fees. You sip fresh water from your flask, noting the difference. This aqueduct water feels fuller, richer than the spring alone, perhaps tinted by its slow pilgrimage through stone, lead, and bladders. You emerge into sunlight again, scaling a narrow ladder toward the castle's infirmary ward. An elderly surgeon awaits, his sleeve rolled to reveal veins like braided ropes. He beckons you over to a wash basin fed by a narrow lead spur from the cistern. He dabs a linen cloth in the water and squeezes it over a patient's wound, hot tea infused with horse chestnut. You watch rivulets course down the basin